The road into Chelsea ran red with the last of the autumn rain, and Naomi Ashworth walked it on foot because the mule was needed at home, and a wagon would have cost her a morning she could not spare. She carried nothing in her hands but a small cloth purse, and inside the purse, wrapped twice in a handkerchief that had been her mother's, was a plain gold ring. She had worked it off over a knuckle grown thin with 2 years of her own labor before she left the house, and she had not let herself look at it since. The town came up out of the flat the way it always did, false-fronted buildings leaning into a single rutted street, and by the time she reached the Mercantile porch her boots were caked to the ankle, and her breath had gone short, though she would not have called it the walking that did that to her. Otis Pruitt stood in the bank's side window watching the road the way a man watches for a debt he expects to go unpaid. He had told her plainly, 6 days before, in front of 2 ranch hands and the postmaster, that the note on the Ashworth place fell due at the end of the week, and that he did not expect a widow with 2 children and no husband to answer it. She had said nothing to that. She had only nodded, the way she had learned to nod at things a body could not yet argue with, and gone home to figure how a woman with no cattle worth selling and no crop yet in might raise $400 in less than a week. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was 31 years old, though the last 2 winters had put a decade's worth of weather into her face. She had come to the Cherokee Nation as a bride of 19, married to Daniel Ashworth in a church so new the pews still smelled of pine sap, and together, they had built the place on Sand Creek out of nothing a man could point to and call luck. Daniel had a gift for reading land that most men spent a lifetime failing to learn, and he had chosen the creek bottom for its grass and its water, and had fenced off a low stretch above the second bend, where a black seep bubbled up through the mud and killed the grass around it in a wide dead ring. Cattle would not drink there. Daniel would not let them try. He had told her once, kneeling at the edge of that ring with his hat pushed back, that a man who did not know what a piece of ground was hiding from him had no business calling it his own, and that some things a man left alone were worth more left alone than dug up. She had not understood him then. She had understood a great many things about her husband only after he was gone, thrown from a green colt he was gentling on a frozen morning 2 winters back, his neck broken before she reached him across the corral. She had buried him on the rise above the house where he could see the creek bottom he had loved, and she had not sold a single acre of it since, though half the county believed by now that she ought to. Caleb was 12 that autumn, old enough to work a full man's day, and young enough still to need reminding that he was not yet a man. He had his father's way of watching a horse before he touched it, and his father's stubbornness about the seep, which he had taken to calling the bad water, the same way Daniel always had, warning off any hand new enough not to know better. Ruth was 7, quick and unbothered by most things, the kind of child who could turn a hard morning ordinary, just by asking a question about something else entirely. Between the 2 of them, and the ranch, and the one hired man she had kept on when 3 others had left for better wages elsewhere, Naomi's days ran from before light to well past dark, and she had grown used to being tired in a way that had stopped announcing itself to her. The hired man was Amos Fitch, gone 60 and stove up in one hip from a fall he never spoke of, who had worked for Daniel Ashworth for 11 years and had told Naomi plainly, the week after the funeral, that he did not intend to go looking for other work at his age, and that she could pay him whenever the ranch allowed it. She had taken him at his word, though it shamed her some seasons to do it. He was the only man left on the place who remembered how Daniel had run cattle and how Daniel had kept the creek bottom, and he had never once suggested to her that she ought to do it differently. The town had its own opinion of how a widow ought to run a ranch, and the opinion did not favor her. It came at her sideways, the way such opinions do in a small place, through the wives who stopped talking when she came into the Mercantile, and through the men who addressed their questions about her stock to Amos Fitch, even when she was standing at his elbow. Cordelia Pruitt, the banker's wife, had said to a circle of women outside the church the previous spring, in a voice not troubled by the thinness of the walls, that it was a hard thing to watch a woman try to hold ground no man was left to hold for her, and that the Lord surely had better plans for the Ashworth place than a widow's stubbornness. Naomi had heard every word of it through the open window where she sat mending, and she had gone on mending. Otis Pruitt was not, by his own reckoning, an unkind man. He had run the Chelsea Bank for going on 15 years, through droughts and a hard winter that had taken a third of the cattle in the territory, and he counted himself a fair judge of what a piece of paper was worth and what it was not. He had watched 3 widows in his many years lose their places to notes they could not answer, and in each case he had felt himself the reluctant instrument of a debt rather than its author. But he had also watched a 4th widow, years before Naomi's time, hold a place through 9 hard seasons on nothing but will, and it had left him with no particular faith that a woman's grit amounted to much against arithmetic. When he looked at Naomi Ashworth's account, he did not see stubbornness worth admiring. He saw a debt 6 days from due and a woman he did not expect to meet it, and he had told her so because he believed, in his own plain accounting of the matter, that he was doing her the kindness of preparing her. That morning on the Mercantile porch, Naomi came through the door into the dim of the store, past barrels of nails and bolts of calico, to the back counter where Otis kept his ledger and where Aldous Renner, who ran the small loan and jewelry trade out of the same counter, sat polishing a watch case with a soft cloth. Otis came out from the bank side to stand at the counter as well, because he had told half the town he expected this reckoning, and he did not intend to miss it. 2 men Naomi knew by sight, not by friendship, had found reasons to be examining harness leather near enough to hear. "Mrs. Ashworth," Otis said, and there was no unkindness in how he said it, only the flat courtesy of a man about to be proven right. "I expect you've come about the note." "I have," Naomi said. She set the small cloth purse on the counter and did not open it yet. "I mean to pay it in full today." Otis's eyebrows went up a fraction, the only visible crack in 15 years of practiced neutrality. "In full, $400, she said. That was the figure. He looked at the purse, small enough to fit inside 2 closed hands, and something in his face settled back into its earlier certainty, as though he had decided already what such a purse could hold and found it wanting. "I'll want to see the money counted before I mark the note paid," he said. "You understand I can't do otherwise." "I understand," she said, and unwrapped the handkerchief and set the ring down on the counter between them. The store had gone quiet enough that the 2 men at the harness leather stopped pretending to examine it. Aldous Renner set down his polishing cloth. Otis Pruitt looked at the ring the way a man looks at something he had not accounted for. A plain gold band, worn thin along the inside curve, and for a moment, nobody at the counter said anything at all. "That's a wedding ring," Otis said, as if the fact needed stating. "It is," Naomi said. "I understand Mr. Renner buys gold as well as watches." Aldous Renner picked up the ring and turned it once under the lamp, reading the faint scratch of an inscription along the inner band that only he was close enough to see. He did not read it aloud. He set it on his small brass scale, made a note in his own book, and named a figure that was not so far short of what she needed, that the shortfall could not be made up by the little coin she carried besides. Naomi did not flinch at the sum, though it was less than the ring's worth to her, by any measure that could not be weighed on a scale. She only nodded, the same nod she had given Otis Pruitt 6 days before, and said that would do. "There are women in this town," Otis said, not unkindly, though the words came out that way regardless, "who would sooner lose the roof than the ring." "There are women in this town who have a roof to lose it under," Naomi said, "and men still living to buy them another ring. I have neither. I have 2 children and a place on Sand Creek that their father built, and I intend for them to keep it." She did not raise her voice to say it. She had learned, in 2 years of being spoken to, as though her grief had made her simple, that the loudest thing in a room was very often the thing least worth hearing. Amos Fitch had come into the store partway through the exchange, having walked in from the wagon where he'd been minding the mule, and he stood now near the door with his hat still on, which was not his habit indoors. "Otis," he said, "you've known this family 11 years through me. I never yet saw Daniel Ashworth make a bad call on that ground, and I never yet saw his wife make one either. You'll have your money counted straight, same as you'd want it from any man." "Nobody's said otherwise, Amos," Otis said, though a flush had come up along his collar that suggested the reminder had cost him something. The money, once counted, came to $411, and Otis Pruitt marked the note paid in full, in a hand that Naomi noticed was not quite as steady as his usual ledger entries. He did not offer congratulations. He folded the paper and handed it across the counter and said only that he hoped the winter ahead would be kinder to her than the last 2, in a tone that made plain he did not much expect it to be. Cordelia Pruitt, who had come into the store partway through and stood now near the dry goods with her basket forgotten on her arm, watched the ring change hands into Aldous Renner's cash box, and said to the woman beside her, in a whisper pitched to Carrie, that some women would sell anything sooner than admit a thing was beyond them. Naomi heard it. She wrapped the empty handkerchief and put it back in her purse, and thanked Mr. Renner for his fairness, and walked back out onto the porch with her children's future paid for and her hand bare for the first time in 12 years. The walk home was longer than the walk-in had been, though the distance had not changed. Caleb met her at the gate, having watched the road since noon the way boys do when they have decided a thing matters more than they are willing to say, and he looked first at her face, and then, without meaning to, at her hand. "You sold it," he said. "I did," she said. "It bought us the winter, and it bought us the ground your father is buried on. I'd sell it again tomorrow for the same trade." Caleb did not say anything more about it, but that evening he walked the fence line above the second bend of the creek, where the black seep still bubbled up through its ring of dead grass, the way he had taken to doing since his father died, as though checking that the one piece of ground his father had cared about keeping untouched was still there and still ruined and still, in its way, guarded. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The week that followed was a quiet one, the particular quiet of a debt finally paid, and Naomi allowed herself, for the first time since the note came due, to think past the immediate week toward the calving season ahead and what it would take to see the place through another year. She did not think about the ring except at odd moments, washing dishes or hanging wash on the line, when her right hand would go looking for the weight that was no longer there. She did not regret the trade. She had told Caleb the truth of it. But grief, she had learned, does not always ask permission before it visits. And it visited her in small ways that week, in the shape of an empty finger and a silence at the supper table where Daniel's chair still sat, unmoved, at the head. Lavinia Tate came by on the Thursday of that week, an older widow from the next section over, who had buried 2 husbands and outlived a fair portion of the county's opinion of what a widow ought to be, and she sat with Naomi on the porch, while Ruth chased a barn cat across the yard, and Caleb worked the far fence with Amos. Lavinia had heard, as everyone in Chelsea had heard by then, about the ring. "I sold my own mother's brooch once," Lavinia said, without being asked, "the winter after my first husband died, to pay a doctor's bill for a fever that took him from us anyway. I grieved that brooch harder than I grieved him for a while, which shamed me considerable, until I came to understand a person can grieve 2 things at once and it doesn't make either grief smaller. I don't grieve the ring," Naomi said. "I grieve what it meant to sell it in front of half the town, like I was settling a gambling debt. That's Otis Pruitt's failing, not yours," Lavinia said. "A man who's never had to choose between a keepsake and his children's supper generally has strong opinions about women who have." They sat a while longer without speaking, watching Ruth and the cat, and before Lavinia left she pressed Naomi's bare hand between both of her own and said only that some trades looked like losses for a good while before they showed their other side, and that she had lived long enough to have seen it happen more than once. 6 days after Naomi paid the note, a wagon came up the Sand Creek Road that nobody at the Ashworth place recognized, drawn by a matched pair too fine and too clean for anything but city use, and it was still a quarter mile off when Otis Pruitt's own buggy came up behind it from the opposite direction, having turned off the main road at almost the same hour, so that both arrived at the Ashworth gate within minutes of each other, on a gray Tuesday afternoon that Naomi would remember for the rest of her life, down to the particular slant of the light. Otis had come, as it turned out, to make an offer, and he made it standing in the yard with his hat in his hand, in a manner that he plainly believed passed for gentleness. He had thought it over, he said, and though the note was settled and the place was hers free and clear for the present, a woman alone with 2 children and 1 aging hand could not be expected to carry a working ranch through many more winters like the last 2, and he was prepared, out of long friendship with her late husband, to make her a fair offer for the place now, while it still had value, rather than see her struggle another year or 2 only to lose it anyway on harder terms. He said it kindly. He believed every word of it kindly. Naomi stood on her own porch steps with Ruth's hand in hers and told him, in the same flat voice she had used at the Mercantile counter, that the place was not for sale and had never once been for sale, and that she would thank him not to raise it again. It was at that moment, with Otis still holding his hat and searching for some further gentle way to press the point, that the second wagon came through the gate. Two men climbed down, one gray-headed and dressed in a good dark suit gone dusty from the road, the other younger with a leather satchel of surveyor's papers under his arm. And the older man introduced himself as Harlan Spear, representing the Council Prospecting Company out of Fort Smith, and asked, with a courtesy that made plain he had rehearsed the question more than once that week, whether he had the honor of addressing Mrs. Daniel Ashworth. "You do," Naomi said. "Ma'am," Spear said. "I'll come to it plainly, since I expect you've a ranch to run and no patience for a long speech. My company has been surveying Seepsine along the Verdigris and its tributaries for the better part of a year, on account of the well they're bringing in over near the bird place, and a man working the creeks for us last month found a black seep on your property, above the second bend, with a smell and a look to it that our chief geologist believes marks a considerable pool of oil beneath this ground. We'd like to lease the mineral rights to that ground from you, on terms I believe you'll find generous. And if the well we'd sink proves out the way we expect, you stand to see royalty income beyond what most ranches in this territory could earn in a lifetime of cattle." Otis Pruitt had gone very still beside his own buggy, his hat forgotten in his hand. For a long moment, nobody in the yard said anything. Ruth had stopped tugging at her mother's hand and stood looking up at the strangers with the plain, unguarded interest of a child who understands only that something important is happening. Caleb had come around the corner of the barn at the sound of the second wagon and stopped there, one hand still on the rail, watching. Amos Fitch had straightened up from the fence line 50 yards off and was walking toward the yard at a pace that was not quite a hurry, but was not his usual pace either. "The seep above the second bend," Naomi said. "My husband fenced that ground off the year we settled here. He wouldn't let a beast near it. That was a wise man," Ma'am Spears said. "Most ranchers we deal with have let their stock trample Seepsine flat without ever wondering what it meant. Or worse, have tried to fill it in and plant grass over it, because it offended their eye. Whoever kept that ground clean for us made our surveyors' work considerably easier, and I'd guess made the difference of some months in how quick we could bring you this offer. He used to say," Caleb said, from the edge of the yard, in a voice that had not meant to be heard by strangers and came out anyway, that a man who didn't know what a piece of ground was hiding from him had no business calling it his own. Spear looked at the boy for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something more serious than a smile, and said that he expected the boy's father would have made a fine partner in the oil business had he lived to see this day. Otis Pruitt found his voice somewhere in the middle of all this, though it came out smaller than his usual counter voice. "You're telling me," he said to Spear, "that this ground, this exact ground, is worth sinking a well on." "I'm telling you, our chief geologist believes it likely enough that the company authorized me to travel out here and make the offer in person rather than by letter," Spear said. "Whether the well proves out is never a certainty until the drill answers the question, but the sign here is as strong as anything we've found along this stretch of the territory, stronger than what we saw before the bird well came in paying, and that well has already paid for the rig 3 times over." The figure Spear named, once he laid out the terms on the porch table a few minutes later with Naomi and Amos both looking on, and Otis Pruitt standing a little apart with his hat still in his hand, was a bonus payment for the lease alone that came to 5 times what she had owed the bank 6 days before, with a royalty share on top of it should the well come in, payable regardless of whether the well ever produced a barrel. Naomi read the paper twice, not because she doubted its plainness, but because a woman who has spent 2 years counting pennies against a debt does not trust a number that large on the first reading. She asked Spear 3 questions about the terms, plain practical questions about the length of the lease and the condition of her grazing ground once the drilling was done, and whether the company would answer for any damage done to the creek itself, and Spear answered each one without hurrying her, in the manner of a man who had learned that a careful question deserved a careful answer, regardless of who was asking it. "I'll want 2 days to think it over," Naomi said, when the questions were answered, "and I'll want Mr. Fitch here to look over the terms with me, since he's run this ground longer than I have and knows what a company like yours might overlook." "Take the 2 days," Spear said. "Take a week if you need it. We've waited a year to find sign this strong. We can wait a few more days to sign it properly." Otis Pruitt had not moved from his spot near the buggy through most of this, and when Spear and the younger surveyor climbed back into their wagon to make the drive back toward Chelsea before dark, he was still standing there, turning his hat slowly in his hands. Naomi came down off the porch steps to see the visitors off, and when she turned back, Otis was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something closer to the look of a man doing arithmetic that had stopped coming out the way he expected. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, "I believe I owe you an apology, and I don't say that easily." "You don't owe me anything, Otis," Naomi said. "You held a note against this place, and I paid it. That's the whole of our business." "That's not the whole of it, and you know it isn't," he said. "I told half this county I didn't expect a widow to hold this ground, and I told you so to your face, more than once, believing I was being kind by preparing you for a loss I thought was coming. I was wrong about the ground. I expect I was wrong about a good deal more than the ground." Naomi looked at him a moment, at a man who had spent 15 years being right about numbers, and had built, on top of that, a good deal of certainty about things numbers could not actually tell him. "You were wrong that a woman can't hold ground," she said. "You weren't wrong that it's hard. It has been the hardest 2 years of my life, and I'll thank you not to mistake how it looks from the porch for how it feels from inside the work." He nodded slowly and said he would send word to the bank clerk to strike a kinder rate on any note she took out with them in future, which was, for Otis Pruitt, as close to a full accounting of fault as the county had likely ever heard from him, and he got into his buggy and drove back toward town without another word. Amos Fitch read the lease terms over 3 evenings by lamplight at the kitchen table, his glasses pushed low on his nose, and found in them only one clause he did not like, a line giving the company the right to lay a supply road across the near pasture without further payment, which he said plainly would cut the best grazing ground in two for no good reason the company could not solve some other way. The lawyer in Chelsea agreed with him and wrote to Fort Smith on Naomi's behalf, and Harlan Spears Company amended the clause inside a week without argument, which Amos took as a fair sign of how the rest of their dealings were likely to go. He did not say much else about the money itself, beyond allowing, the evening the amended lease came back for her signature, that Daniel Ashworth would have been proud of the wife who kept his ground the way he'd have kept it, oil or no oil, and that he himself intended to go on doing the same work he had always done, at the same wage he had always drawn, because a man his age had no use for more money than he already knew how to spend. News of the Council Prospecting Company's visit to the Ashworth place reached Chelsea before Naomi did, the way such news always outran the people it concerned, and by the time she came into town 2 days later to have the lease terms read over by a lawyer Amos trusted, the whispering that had followed her all autumn had changed its character entirely. Cordelia Pruitt, who had told a circle of women the previous spring that the Lord surely had better plans for the Ashworth place than a widow's stubbornness, stopped Naomi outside the Mercantile to say, with a warmth that had not been there before, that she had always admired how Naomi kept that ground, and Naomi thanked her for it, and did not remind her of anything said the previous spring, because a woman who has just been proven right about the hardest thing she ever did does not need to spend the proving on anyone else's discomfort. It was Aldous Renner who stopped her longest, at the back counter where the ring had changed hands 8 days before. He reached beneath the counter and set a small wrapped bundle in front of her, and when she unwrapped it, it was her ring. "I never sold it on," he said. "I bought gold most days of my working life, and I know the weight and the shine of a wedding band. A woman means to buy back the first chance she gets, same as I know the weight of one sold outright and meant to stay sold. I set yours aside in my strongbox the day you brought it in, on my own risk, believing you'd be back for it before the year was out. I'll take back what I paid you, if you're willing, and no more." Naomi looked at the ring in her palm, worn thin along the inside curve, the faint scratch of an inscription she had traced with her thumb 1,000 times before she ever set it on that counter. She paid Aldous Renner what he asked, and a little more besides, which he tried to refuse and did not succeed in refusing, and she put the ring back on her hand in the middle of the Mercantile floor, with no ceremony at all, the way a woman puts a tool back where it belongs. Louvenia Tate came by again on a Sunday not long after, and this time it was Naomi who spoke first of the ring, holding up her hand without being asked so the older woman could see it back where it belonged. Louvenia took the hand in both of hers, the same way she had taken it bare the week before, and said only that she had told her so, in the mildest voice she owned, and that some trades did show their other side eventually, same as she had said they might. Naomi sent her home that evening with a jar of the last of the season's plum preserves and a standing invitation to Sunday supper which Lavinia took up more often than not from then on, so that the empty chair at the head of the table stopped being quite so empty a thing to look at. The well the Council Prospecting Company sank above the second bend of Sand Creek came in on a cold morning some weeks later. And it came in paying, though Naomi would say afterward, when neighbors asked, that the well itself was the smaller part of what that autumn had given her. The money changed a good deal about the Ashworth place in the months that followed. It paid Amos Fitch 3 years of back wages he had never once asked for and would not have accepted if she had offered them any sooner than she could truly spare them. It put new fence along the whole of the creek bottom, not to keep cattle off the well, but to keep the rest of the ground the way Daniel had always kept it, cared for rather than simply used. It sent Caleb, 2 winters later, to a school in Tahlequah that his father would have wanted for him, and that his mother could not have dreamed of affording the autumn the note came due. What the money did not change was the shape of Naomi's days, which still began before light and still ran through supper, and still ended, most evenings, with her sitting on the porch step while Ruth chased the last of the light across the yard, and Caleb walked the fence line above the second bend from old habit, checking on ground that no longer needed checking the way it once had, but that he checked anyway, because some habits are not really about the ground at all. On the evening the first royalty payment came by post from Fort Smith, Naomi sat on the porch with the letter unopened in her lap for a long while before she read it, watching the light go copper over the rise where Daniel was buried. And she thought about a ring wrapped twice in her mother's handkerchief and set down on a counter in front of half the town, and about a man kneeling once at the edge of a dead ring of grass, telling her that some things left alone were worth more left alone than dug up. She had not understood him then. She understood, sitting on that porch with her own hand bare no longer, that he had not been telling her to leave the ground alone forever. He had been telling her to trust it long enough, to let it show her what it was, which was a different thing entirely, and a harder one, and the only inheritance that had ever mattered on that place besides the 2 children asleep inside. She read the letter by the last of the light, and then she went in to bank the stove for the night, and the ring caught the lamplight once on her way through the kitchen door, the way it always had, worn thin and plain and entirely her own. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.